By some standards, we may not need a debate. More people are enrolled in higher education presently than went to universities in all of human history. And in the past decade, 40 more million children have entered primary school, bringing down the numbers significantly of those without access. So it is possible, it might be possible in a debate to argue that the present leadership is doing a good job. It's reaching millions and millions of people. It's extending all over the world. But it also might be possible to argue that continuing into the future with present models of leadership won't be sufficient to meet the challenges ahead. And I think that's the essence of our debate today. We're going to debate among the panel for about 20 to 30 minutes, so I want to put you on notice. I want to get to your questions and your comments in the debate as quickly as we possibly can. To help me in the debate and to help us sort out the issues, I would like to ask our panelists to come on the stage now. I want to welcome Wayne Davies, a senior human resources executive of the General Electric Corporation for this region based in Dubai. Josephine Green, a strategic thinker and planner who was in charge of the Philips Design Strategic Forecast, and Paul Kolditz from South Africa, who is a practicing attorney, an activist parent who, because of the combination of the two, entered the public space to head the Federation of Schools of South Africa. So we will begin a debate and welcome your questions, also your questions online and from Twitter. And I know from time to time a magic device will appear to light up, and we'll have questions from the audience and Twitter at the same time. Thank you. So if we're going to debate leadership, we need to either say we've got to have more leaders like we have now, or different leaders, or better leaders than we have now, or maybe even a different formula for leadership. So, Paul, I wanted to start with you and go across the panel. What do we need now in the form of leadership at any level of education, and how different is it going to be in the future than it has been in the past?
Alan, thank you. As you've quite rightly pointed out, we've made huge progress globally as far as access to education is concerned. It does not seem as if we're making the same kind of progress with regard to the quality of education. But the challenges as far as leadership is concerned is I think we need to recognize that no leader has all the answers at this stage. The qualities of leadership the principles of leadership will basically remain the same. We're talking about values, we're talking about competence, knowing your field, and then we're also talking about compassion, something that we were fortunate to be exposed to at a very high level in our country with the inspirational leadership of a person such as Nelson Mandela. But I think
he has an impact still in how you
think. He still has an impact. He's had an impact on my life, and he's had an impact on the lives of many South Africans, as I believe he's had an impact, a huge impact on the lives of many people across the globe. The main thing that Nelson Mandela taught us is compassion. It's humility. It is exactly the fact that no leader has all the answers, and we have to go into a process of collaborative leadership, and that leaders must always remain learners. And then again, from our South African perspective, I want to emphasize the fact that I see a need for leadership by parents, the primary educators of children. Parents need to take more responsibility for the education of their children, but education systems and governments also need to create the opportunity for parents to become more involved in the formal education of their children.
Well, Josephine, is that enough? these values, the engagement of parents, the engagement of learners, do we need something more, or will that take us into the future?
I think it will help to take us into the future. I think we probably do need more. I was interested to hear about Nelson Mandela because what I believe and we're experiencing is something I call a change of age, not an age of change. A change of age because we're going from one way of seeing and of being, of doing in the world, to another way of seeing and being and doing. And interestingly, it's in those transformational moments, and I think of the great transformers, the great visionaries, the great messengers, whether it's Jesus, Muhammad, Gandhi, Mandela. These were all people who helped us through a transition because they brought a new message. And I tried to think, who would I look to at the moment for such a message? Well, I think I found one today. And that's an interesting aspect of leadership because the person who won the WISE Award, I had tears in my eyes. Well, that doesn't happen. Actually, it happens quite a lot now I think about it. But anyway, it happened today because that man spoke to my heart. He spoke to my soul. But interestingly, he wasn't at the top of a hierarchical, top-down command and control structure. He was a man who actually could have been, gave it up, and he took a bottom-up approach. And I think that...
And is that the transformation in part you'd like to see more bottom-up?
Not that I would like to see it, it's actually happening, because I think what is going on is several things in leadership. And the first, I think leadership is certainly in crisis, as heck, we're all in crisis with this change of age. But I think a problem with leadership is that increasingly people don't want to be led. That's the interesting thing. And that is difficult for us, and particularly, excuse me, looking at many people in the room, we who are in our 50s and our 60s, we came from a fairly top-down view of leadership because the model that has sustained us for millennia, which is a hierarchical, simplistic command and control structure, has produced leaders who go through that structure and get to the top. And that is what is in crisis, because those very structures, instead of creating now leaders that are inspirational, leaders that see leadership as service, leaders that see leadership as enabling, facilitating the talent and the creativity, are instead locked into not leadership but management. Management, administrative systems, targets, micromanagement, and this is squeezing our lifeblood. And what's happened is while all that is going on, and a lot of our leaders are still there, and in my head, partly myself, we now know that that hierarchical model has collapsed because of social media, because there's 7 billion of us all doing different things, because we're global and connected. And so suddenly it's flattened, and we can't do what as leaders we've done, which is tried to standardize and control complexity, because it's out of control. And so the problem I think we have now is we need leaders who appreciate that we have to actually distribute capacity through the system. Our only way of moving forward in such a complex world that's out of control is collaboratively working together and releasing all that capacity, not stifling it, but releasing it so that we learn collectively to work together, to experiment, to learn, to fail, and to become constantly agile in dealing with problems. And so we need, I think, two types of leadership desperate at the moment. The visionaries with the messages, which have meaning and purpose and compassion. And the other side, a service that will enable people in a transition to become capable of continuously learning collectively.
And I think collaboration comes out of both of your remarks. Wayne, as a business person, as you hear people involved in education talking about what leadership is required, what does business have to say to education? The way you pick leaders, is that instructive for us? And the way you reward leaders, should we be considering things like that?
Sure, and great comments from both Paul and Josephine that maybe I can build on. There are a few things that both my colleagues said. Paul talked about values. I think that's really, really important. Josephine mentioned that people don't want to be led or managed, and it's very true. People, even at junior level, want to be inspired, they want to be engaged, and they want to believe in a purpose. And that's very different to the traditional, certainly the regime that I grew up in business, which was about vertical progress. It was about taking control and managing. And certainly as we look at the workforce of today and the workforce of tomorrow, they've got vastly different values, vastly different beliefs, and so their expectations from employers are aligned around what they want. And so if we think about Generation Y or the millennials, and certainly people like me, a Generation X person, the challenge for us is how do we stay connected with the workforce of tomorrow? I think millennials today account for 1/3 of the workforce, but I think in 3 years will be 50% of the workforce. Yeah. And also, Alan, if you look at the size of the Generation X population, Generation Y is significantly bigger. And so we know that the leaders of tomorrow will actually progress quicker. We put into big leadership roles sooner. And so the challenge for us to think around is how do we prepare the workforce of tomorrow for leadership? And so as we think around the collaboration between business and education, I think we also need to look at the leadership traits we require from people going forward. The word collaboration is widely used. And so, again, back to my analogy of, managers grow and they seek to control and manage. Leaders of today collaborate. And it's not around what I own, what I control, what I direct. It's around the purpose and the value that I can drive by working with others. And that's very, very different. And so as we redefine the leadership values, I think it's really, really important that the connections between business and education remain very strong. Because I fear, as I look at leadership within my own company, that we're actually losing connection with the workforce of tomorrow, whether it be in social media, whether it be around areas such as diversity. With the pace of change happening so quickly, there is a real danger that the leaders of today actually speak a different language to the employees of tomorrow. And I think that's a really tough challenge for business, and that's where I think we need to do more and more work with educational establishments.
Are we doing enough also to empower women through education to be leaders in companies and government and in education?
I'm fairly new to this region, and so I have a role supporting our businesses in the Middle East and North Africa. So I'm learning by the day. But the one thing that astounds me, the challenges around gender diversity in leadership, but generally in employment. Coming from a European business, an American business, we focused a lot on women in leadership. But I came from a business that had 70% female employees. And so our challenge was, how do we bring these up? How do we grow these people? How do we make them ready for leadership? As I've arrived here in the Middle East, our total female population is 15%. Our population of female leaders is 13%. And as I talk anecdotally to other businesses, they tell me that's normal in this region. And yet we know for a fact that at least half of people going into higher education are female. If I look at Saudi Arabia, over half of students at university are female. And certainly as you get to master's degrees, PhDs, that increases to 60% plus. And yet the proportion of female employees in my company in Saudi Arabia is 3%. And so the question we ask is, what happens? Where do these people go? And so I think understanding the values, the beliefs, and the motivators for women in leadership becomes incredibly important for us as we attempt to reposition the value proposition of employment and leadership. Because as I look at my own company, which has very strong American roots, the value proposition for leadership we have today is built very much on our perceived motivators from men.
Could I build on that, please?
Please.
Because it's close to my heart. I think the thing that we really must understand, I've been involved, I worked at Philips, which is a Dutch company, for 15 years, so we had lots of diversity programs. The first thing I dislike intensely is to give the business plan for why women are important. We're 50% of the population, I'm having to give the business plan. I found that really insulting. I did do the business plan, but I think what's interesting here is that you've got a situation where you've got lots of different change agents. You've talked about Gen Y. Gen Y, they've done some really interesting research, London Business School, Amsterdam University, and it's all coming out the same. And it's not just Gen Y, it's also the digital natives. So let's say 8 to 25-year-olds. I mean, the digital natives, 8 to 14, they're a different race. And they don't like hierarchy, they don't want to be led, they don't want to be controlled, they like to work things out, they like to do things by trial and error. They're working out social activism, and some of this we've seen, of course, with the recent uprising. So we've got the young who don't fit in to the old system. We've got women. We never invented the old system, so we're not very interested, really. I had many women come to me at Philips as a mentor and say, how do I get to the top of the pyramid? And I said, do you want to get to the top of the pyramid? We'd start a discussion. If they did, well, then go ahead. But it was amazing how many didn't. You found with women, they were coming out of the universities with higher ratings than men, and I don't believe the next society is one better than the other. We're trying to readdress the balance. But they would come out, and then they would go to the corporates. They would, and somebody said, Aviva, a friend of mine, that it was like second-generation immigrants, because these women would come out, equal opportunities, the same as in the universities. They'd get to the corporates, and they'd learn the language of the corporates. And then,
so education didn't empower them?
no, education totally empowered them. It empowered them that they felt totally equal opportunities. Once they got to the establishment, the hierarchy, in this case the corporates, then they learnt the language of the corporates. But after about 2 years, they realized that the corporate hadn't learnt their language. Because the language of the hierarchies is, in fact, quite inverted commas male. And it's about winners, losers, competition, getting to the top. You know, there's a lot of testosterone. And that is really, we don't have it. And so what happened is they did one of three things. They either became men in skirts, they got to the top and they weren't change agents because they were doing the same as the blokes, or they became invisible, which is a dangerous place in a corporate, as you know, Wayne, or they got angry and they left. Or if you're really mad like me, you become a change agent yourself. So you've got, on the one hand, young people.
But is there a successful woman you would point to and say, yes, they're transformative, they're educated for the age ahead?
I don't think, not within the old I do not believe that you can. I believe profoundly that behaviour is determined by context. If you put people in a certain context with a certain set of behaviours and values, it is very difficult to free yourself from those values. And if you get to the top of them, whether you're in a corporate or you're in a kind of university or you're in politics, and you get to the top with the best of intentions, you've had to play the game. You know what the game is with hierarchies. By the time you get there, you are the game, and you can't change it. So I think one of the things of clever leaders, transitional leaders of the future, is identify who your change agents are. They are women. They are the young. They're the cultural creatives, about 35-40% of the population who believe in more sustainable values, and enable them. Have them do you become the facilitator, have them drive the future.
Well, as Paul operates a system very unique in the involvement of parents, are parents change agents for this age? Are they thinking the way Josephine and Wayne are thinking? How do they impact leadership in your system?
Well, I can only speak from my own personal exposure and experience, Alan, and I very strongly believe that parents are change agents, can make a huge difference in school education for their children in terms of their oversight role as members of school governing bodies. In South Africa, all our public schools must have, in terms of the law, governing bodies, oversight bodies, accountability bodies, and these consist of a majority of parents.
So majority parents.
The majority must be parents. It's teachers and non-teaching staff, administrative staff, and in the secondary schools also learners. So the learners are also developed into this leadership role. But yes, the majority must always be parents. So parents have a great influence, and it's having a good effect, a positive effect, in those communities where you have parents that have the capacity to make a contribution. We still have a huge challenge in communities in which the social systems, the social structures are not that well organized for people to be involved as parents and as school governors. That's a challenge for the future, but that's a challenge we're looking forward to. And I think we're making great progress as far as that is concerned. So much so that I'm beginning to get a little concerned about men in South Africa. Women are those who are being incapacitated. Women are those who are achievers in terms of our education system. We've made huge progress as far as that is concerned. I'm getting a little concerned about the future of men in my country.
Well, we could have a separate debate on that, but what I'd really like to do is turn to the audience. We've talked about fundamental change, drivers of change. Some values that I think would be true 10 or 20 years ago are still true today. We've talked about new models to involve and encourage change in education, and we've talked about the way in which business can and should have an active voice. And then what happens when educated people get to business. We'd really like to open the floor for your questions and your comment. I'd appreciate it if you would wave your hand if you'd like to ask one. We're going to start there. And would you be sure to tell us your name and where you're from? And if you'd like to direct the question to a particular panelist, I know we'd all welcome that. So please, where are you from?
I'm from South Africa. I'm Vuisa Tanga from Cape Peninsula University of Technology, Vice Chancellor. My question is to Paul.
Are you a parent also?
I'm everything.
A good characteristic of leadership.
Paul is concerned about the position of men in terms of empowerment in South Africa. What would you regard as empowerment, Paul, as women empowerment in the context of the control of the economy of the country, in terms of only 10% of women or less than 10% being in the corporate as women, even less for black women? What is your concern? Thank you.
Shall I go?
Yes,
I was speaking purely from a school education perspective. I'm not a business person. And I must say that my comment was a little bit in jest, not very serious. But as far as education in South Africa is concerned, and even higher education, the sector in which you're involved, we see more enrollment and more qualifiers in terms of being women compared to men. We're seeing that women are taking education more seriously than the men are doing. What happens outside or after the school is beyond our control. So I would not like to express myself on exactly what's happening, but she's absolutely right, and that is that in that sector we still have huge challenges, and that's where the collaboration with the school environment comes in.
Just to clarify, we have a Twitter question about, is there a quality or characteristic of leadership in a developing country that's really different than in a developed country? I wonder how each of the panelists feel about that. Is there a difference by stage of development? Paul, then Josephine, then Wayne.
I think one thing I think is, it's a roundabout way to answer this question, but I think very much in the developing world and increasingly in the developed world, there's a kind of new development model emerging. That development model is known as the social innovation movement, or however you want to call it, but it's really a decentralized model rather than the old model of big companies, concentrated energy, shipping stuff all around the world. You know, India, China, other countries are showing us that there are alternatives, and we're actually importing this idea of decentralizing production and consumption and involving communities and stakeholders in rethinking the production model and rethinking lifestyles. And that's a leadership that isn't in a person, or isn't in, but it's a model. It's a model of showing that there could be another way of development which allows you to have more control over your human destiny, and in itself is an empowering model, because the size and big corrupts, and very big absolutely corrupts, and we've seen this with the banks, etc. If we can and so we look at the world and we see all over experiments bottom up of people wanting to retake a human dimension, have more control over their destiny, and collectively as stakeholders, often supported in different ways, possibly with certain skills, etc., to start to build up their communities as an economic and social unit. And this, I think, is a model of a new leadership that will emerge and throw up new leaders.
Wayne or Paul, difference between advanced and developing countries?
You know, the one thing we see more and more, Alan, in developing countries is this natural, innate entrepreneurial spirit that you don't get to the same extent in the US or indeed in Western Europe. And that's incredibly exciting. It's contagious. It's almost intoxicating. But the challenge for us as employers then is, how are we equipping these people to grow faster than ever before? Because if you did grow up in a developed economy country, then you grew in a pretty structured and stable way. And the pace of growth in developing countries is so fast that we're having to now develop employees and leaders faster than ever before. And so how do you take advantage of that optimism, that belief, the belief in purpose, whilst also ensuring that people are growing to be pragmatic, to be balanced, etc. And again, I connect that back to some of the traits that we see in women as leaders. And you know, it's dangerous to generalize, I know that, but you know, in general, as we look at our employees, we tend to see men that are developing and they're wanting to grow, they want to take control, they're driven by, you know, financial metrics, they're driven by their perception of success. Women tend to be more motivated by collaborative leadership, by making a difference, and sometimes the non-material things. And so how do you connect those two? And that's one of the challenges for both business and indeed for education as we look forward. And so...
And
yes,
everywhere.
Absolutely, Alan. And so as we look at developing talent, whether it be in Asia, the Middle East, or in Africa, we see massive potential, but clearly not a great deal of depth. And so we have to figure out, how do we work together to prepare these people so that they're fit for the future? And I think that's a real challenge both for business and for education.
Alan,
Paul,
can I just add very quickly, building on that, that I think also when the Twitter person is asking about are there examples of leadership, you know, new leaders, the problem is that our society has very much given attention to one intelligence. We have 10 intelligences, if you look at Howard Gardner's research. And that goes from the rational, logical, linear, which is the one we have tended to give most attention to and is the one that exists in most of our institutions. But there's kinesthetic, body, there's creativity, there's interpersonal and intrapersonal. And so, in a way, until we really dig into diversity and accept that there's also such a broad range of intelligences that includes the rational and the non-rational, the emotional, the spiritual, etc., it's hard to allow people with these qualities to emerge as leaders because society doesn't proclaim it as a valuable resource.
Yeah, I'd like to link up with what Wayne has said about, I don't really see a difference in model necessarily. It's more that we see, as far as I can see, that in the developing and emerging countries, we're seeing a stronger drive by the society, by non-governmental organizations, getting involved in leadership and directing matters where governments seem to fail to take the necessary lead in the development of the people of the countries.
And an important driver of change. Can I take a question? The lady in the red jacket, and then we'll go to the gentleman from Thailand. Yes.
I'm Gülsün Sağlamer from Istanbul Technical University. I believe that there is a big difference between the developed, advanced countries and developing countries in terms of level of uncertainties where the decisions are taken. So it puts a lot of pressure on the leadership in the developing countries where uncertainties are very high. So it creates differences in the style, in the decision-making processes of the leaders in the developing countries, I believe. That's a comment, not a question.
There's a good response to that, and that is
I think
that,
we'd like a good response.
okay, here it is.
And then,
I think what's interesting is that the future is always going to be about uncertainty more and more, because many of our leaders come from a world that we thought was predictable and linear. But with the complexity now, we will be in a permanent state of unpredictability, emergence, and uncertainty. So those very values that may you find be difficult may be the values we are going to need of being able to lead and manage in uncertainty, because that's the new reality. So
These leaders will be more experienced in the future.
yeah,
That's what you're saying.
that's exactly what I'm
Okay.
saying. Yes.
and as Paul is suggesting, the social dynamics and rate of change are so fast in some situations that in the advanced countries, you're not going to get that experience. A question from Thailand. And then I see a question in the middle in the back there, if the microphone will start up that way.
Thank you, Dr. Goodman. My name is Ninat Olanwarut, Secretary General of the Association of Southeast Asian Institutions of Higher Learning. I think there is a difference between the development and developing countries, definitely. I usually work with many vice chancellor, rector, and president in the region, and we are excusing one country, I don't want to mention the name of the country, that being very autocratic. Say, no, they're not very autocratic, they're very pragmatic. See, the thing is, in Southeast Asia especially, we are using very centralized system, whereas the West are more decentralized. We heard the word empowerment for so long, and yet we wait to see the leaders with what you're talking about, collaborative leadership, or passionate, and yet we have to see it's coming. I run away from the flood and the chaotic government intervention and the exercising control and changing new policies. And right now, a Commission on Higher Education, the Ministry of Education is very messy with the flood and everything else. Very chaotic because of lack of leadership. And then not only just in Thailand alone, I mean the region, because every time the government have intervention and there's no continuity, because the previous government have the good policy, all of a sudden now they change a new policy, they stop this and they say, this is my policy now. I mean, very, very disruptive in a sense. There's lack of continuity and government intervention, especially politics intervention. In fact, some of my friends now being very good vice chancellor, and all of a sudden they say, well, we don't want to extend your term. I mean, so some of the good leaders cannot survive. I mean, because of political intervention. I don't know, maybe the West doesn't have the problem we do, but leadership itself, we still have, leadership is a very positive term, but again, whatever you described, the three of you, we haven't yet seen it. I mean, we are still in the stage, and then now we have problem of with the new technology. The leaders now cannot cope with we are talking about speaking different language of the employees of tomorrow. And again, I mean, we have to learn to cope with the new generation now, because the students now, they are very I took computer in 1965, and now I'm computer illiterate. And how can we cope? How can we keep up with the students who can learn on their own? They can Google, they can learn on their own. We are still very slow, we cannot keep up with them. And the parents, again, they cannot teach a student anymore, because the student don't want to teach the parents about computers. So we cannot keep up with the new generation. And this is something about leadership gap. I don't know. I mean, maybe the West doesn't have that problem. I see people 70 years old, they're still working on computer. I had to relearn my computer skill, getting my secretary to teach me how to do it. I mean, this is maybe the gap that we have to keep up. And all professor cannot keep up with the student either. Maybe you can help us. Thank you.
Can I respond?
Please, and are parents actually the source of stability in this age of change?
Well, I'd like to react to 2 points. The first one is the concept of empowerment. I think a good leader would recognize that people have power. You don't need to empower them. All you need to do is recognize the fact that people have power and that you should unleash that power as a leader. As far as the technology is concerned and the ICT revolution, yes, it's true that I learned from my children how to use Google and all the technological miracles that are happening around us. But the point is, my role remains as a parent to teach my child and to lead my child and to be a role model for my child in using the technology responsibly with credibility, with honesty and all of those values. My role as a stabilizing factor as a parent in my child's upbringing and in my child's use of and confrontation of all the changes taking place, I think has in fact increased.
Question in the back. And then I see a question in the front row here, yes. So a question in the back first. And folks on that side of the auditorium, if you think I'm not looking at you, it's because the lights. So wave, really wave, and I'll get you. I see a hand way in the back. Okay.
My name is Dr. Ahmed Al-Sayyad. I would just like to raise a point and ask a question. Post the Arab Spring, the cycles of business, let's say, has changed. We've got a lot of elections in government posts. We've got elections for university presidents. We've got elections even for university deans. And we've got businesses that used to be, you can finish a deal and conclude a deal with the number 1 person, number 2, 3, 4, whatever. Now you need to build bottom up. You can't, no one will dare finish a business or conclude a project or something top down anymore in at least the key countries of the Arab Spring. So in my opinion, there will be a lot of retraining of people to do business, of leadership, at education, at industry, at government, and even at multinational companies who have been doing business the old way for the past 30, 40 years themselves. So it's not only about educating the populations, it's about educating the people who are dealing with them from the international community. So having all these people involved, what collaborative initiatives can emerge from this perspective that will join these various stakeholders, if any? Thank you.
Or also collaborative models, which seem to work. Why don't we come across the panel for comment? Wayne, an observation?
Sure. And it's a great question. Now, in the same way to the last point, which was how do people stay connected with the new generation, whether it's technology? And, you know, one of my observations over time is it's simply not optional any longer. You know, to be connected with people, you need to be incredibly contemporary in your use of technology and media. And I even put myself in that category, and I use things like Twitter not because I want to or because I like it, because I feel compelled to do it, to at least attempt to stay in touch. And so if you're in academia or if you're in business, if you select not to use these channels, then you simply lose touch and you can't perform, you can't be effective. And I think that's incredibly important as we look towards leaders of tomorrow, is to understand that these things are simply not optional, that pace of change is so incredibly fast that you have to stay with it. But then as we think about collaboration, to the same point, if we think around how leaders need to stay in touch with employees of tomorrow, think around the relationship between business and education and that collaboration. And, you know, as a millennial said to me recently, look, you talk a lot about work-life balance. Why do you do that? There's work and there's life and they're the same thing. And I don't think that way. But I think we need to think around the connection between business and education the same. It is that how do we bridge that gap? Back to the point on parents, parents instill values and beliefs that really equip people for the future. And when you look at the employees of tomorrow, they no longer want to work for a corporation or a logo. They want to work for a person that inspires, that engages, that motivates. And in the olden days, we used to choose to work for a company that had a CEO that was inspirational. But today, employees want to work for a boss that's inspirational, that really drives a passion, a belief, and a purpose. And so, when we think about technology, I thought I was pretty smart recently when we were interviewing people, and I would Google them and I check them on LinkedIn. Believe you me, they do that far more to us than we realize. And so that transparency is bigger than ever. And so, leadership, visibility, personally, professionally. I found a website recently called Glassdoor.com. I'd never heard about it. But that's where anonymously people go in and rate you as a leader. And so there's nowhere to hide, and so we have to really be prepared for that as we look to the future. Even if it makes us uncomfortable, it's simply not optional.
I think that's a very fundamental point. There is nowhere to hide, especially in the digital age. Josephine.
To answer directly your question, if it's any use, and sharing some of my experiences, and particularly in Philips, I think first of all, what you said, it reminds me a little bit of the saying, this is the worst of times and this is the best of times. The worst of times is things are collapsing, the best of times because we can reinvent and maybe go towards the kind of society and way of living that we want. So it would sound to me in this that you have to do, that the first thing is you really have to have some kind of glue, and the glue really comes from a vision. And that vision, I think, has to be done collectively amongst these people who have now got to learn to train, to skill, and to work together. So there's got to be a vision somewhere. Whether somebody is clever enough to come up with a vision, or even better, that the vision is an engagement by which then everybody buys into it. And then the second thing I would say is you have an opportunity now to really start to develop the new skills that are needed. We've talked a lot about what doesn't work. And here's an example. In Philips, we were doing a lot on health. When you're thinking of actually innovating in health, that's a stakeholder business. You can't have two people in a lab inventing a new health delivery system, because you've got to have the patient who's often at home, the carer, the loved ones, the physician, the internet expert patient groups. It's a whole ecosystem. And this is really what we're going to be doing in the future. Innovation is going to be in reinventing many of the challenges we're facing in health, education. These are the big social issues, not products, but the social issues. And there you need different skills. You need to be able to work across functions. You need to be able to work multidisciplinary teams, so the scientist can talk to the social scientist, who can talk to the strategist, who can talk to the marketer. You need to have the skills of people who can identify who the stakeholders are and bring them together and facilitate these people to draw out their insights as you try to innovate. You need a lot of communicative and emotional skills. So I think when you have such a thing to build up from the bottom, tabula rasa, build the vision collectively, think of the skills you need, and then drive home that possibility to achieve those skills, and you're ready for the future.
Alan, thank you. Once again, maybe just a question from my side, or even maybe a challenge and a statement to what Josephine had made earlier, and that is people don't want to be led anymore. I don't think that is true. I think people are looking at leadership, but they're looking for a different kind of leadership. And there I want to link up again with what Wayne has said. The modern person doesn't want to work for a particular business. He or she wants to work for a particular person, a leader. And that tells us that leadership, and I think the Arab Spring and the British summer and everything has told us that leadership now has to be focused more than ever before on the fact that we must lead people. It's about people, and it's about the relationships between people, and it's about opportunities for other people, not for the leader, for the followers.
I want to take
So-
the challenge. May I just take the challenge? Because I heard somebody here as well say, I agree. I've taken the challenge. I agree and I don't agree. I agree that I don't think eventually people do want to be led, but I think there's a transitional phase. I think we are still not confident enough to self-organize. We don't know how to, but we will get there. So I think in the meantime, we need transitional leaders who have strong purpose and vision and who are the facilitators and enablers. But I would bet you, anybody willing to take this bet? I would bet you that in 30 years' time, when we really have gone to a collaborative, networked, self-organizing system, that there forms of maybe transitory leadership for a certain moment, for a certain skill, you will have a leader. It will then transform. It will be a much more fluid concept than the leader. So I think ultimately you will find with the democratization of society, our concepts of leadership and the desire to be led will become less.
A question here in the front row, and then there was a question way in the back. If you wave your hand again, the microphone will start migrating, please. So we'll go here, we'll go to the back, we'll go to the vigorously waving hand over there. Please.
Thank you. My question.
You're from where?
Oh, I'm Mondo Kagonyera, Chancellor Makerere University in Uganda. My question goes to any of them.
Please.
It's two-pronged. One, in leadership, you have to differentiate between political leadership and business leadership. In business, the yardstick for success is very clear and I think simple, and therefore you can easily decide what sort of leadership you want. But I'm talking about political leadership and this monster called power. When someone has power, how do you expect them to approach this, developing new approaches to leadership? The second one is, one of the most influential agents for change these days is the media. Does the media, the world media, have the same purpose as we have in this room or not? And if we don't, what can be done about it?
Well, good questions. Maybe we'll start with Wayne, then Paul.
Sure, and maybe I'll take the first part and maybe one of the others take the second.
Also,
But look, it's a great question around power, which to your point is traditional. It's how people were brought up and what they aspire, and it means success. Influence is way more important today. To drive change and to have a compelling drive to do the right thing, whatever that is, without thinking around what does it mean for me, what does it mean for my job, my authority, my salary. And so we're seeing a huge switch in values in that respect as we think around leaders that actually influence without having direct accountability or direct control, which really lends itself very closely to the collaborative approach that Josephine talked around. And so leaders that have a far broader perspective than, looking selfishly at their own area. And so, to your point, well, what if you have leaders like that? I think, quite honestly, they need to get with the program pretty quickly. And we're even seeing that in business nowadays, that leaders that think that way, quite frankly, are out of date and out of touch. And because that impacts their decision-making, because first and foremost, they're thinking about themselves. And that's not in the interest of the employees, and that's not in the interest of business. And so, that cultural shift in how we measure leaders based on the impact of what they do, regardless of what's their direct accountability, becomes really, really important for companies nowadays.
I don't know if you've had an opportunity to look at I think it's the Webster Dictionary's definition of success. It's the accumulation of power, wealth, and status. Now that's interesting, isn't it? Because what we have to be working on, in fact, is some of that. So in our hierarchical structures, and You know, I'm a macro historian. We got a lot from these structures. There's no way that you can look back and say it was wrong. I'm just saying it made sense. It doesn't make sense anymore. But it gave us many things. It gave us the welfare state. Well, we're trying to hang on to it at the moment. It gave us free education. It gave many things. But it was once relevant. It's increasingly irrelevant. But in that structure, success was the accumulation of wealth, power, and status. So anybody who's bright goes for success, goes for wealth, power, and status. And I did some workshops with a group of people. And we decided to start to play and reinvent what we would want success to be in the future. Because actually, these are all constructs. God did not say success is wealth, power, and status. In fact, he'd probably say quite the reverse. But, so these are mutable concepts. So we played around in these workshops, going from success. And one woman said, well, success is a good social outcome in which all the participants have contributed. I rest my case.
But let me just throw one onto that, is I think we have to be careful attempting to define success, because success is very personal. And so my interpretation of success is probably very different to yours or Paul's or Alan's. And so as we think about leadership propositions and how companies differentiate themselves, it's very easy to fall into the trap of assuming what success looks like to you, and because it's so personal. And you know, back to your point, you know, power, money, etc. I'm pretty sure as you talk to the youngsters of today, that's not important to them.
That is true, but if you think of our leaders at the moment, I mean, we have a problem in Britain that actually, in the last 30 years, I think business was good up to 30 years ago. Then we had a thing called financial capitalism, and the world went berserk. And what's happened there now, and this is not me, this is The Guardian, talking about our leaders as the feral elite. It's that group of people at the top of corporate, of banks, of media, that have and are accumulating vast amount of wealth and power. And that's our problem. Whether we don't want to define success, they are still pursuing the classical definition of success, and it's causing us a lot of problems because they are going exactly for that. Prestige, vast shed loads of money and power. And so I'm afraid in that respect, you know, we have a problem, Euston.
I agree. But sorry, just to answer it one more time, is one of the new traits that we're seeing in people, and think about successful companies, think about Steve Jobs, think about all these, they take risks, whether it's a technology risk, investing capital in a product, whether it's a blockbuster drug, for example. And so one of the challenges that business have is to become comfortable with a certain amount of risk, especially as you look at the growth regions. I mean, somebody made the example about Turkey. In my region, Turkey is the most stable country, which is incredible. But, you think about Libya, you think about Iraq, you think about all these countries where we're trying to develop a people vision, and the truth is, we don't know what's going to happen next week. Now, the leaders that evolve in those countries are so agile and so nimble and so able to respond. If you compare that to the US, where we've traditionally grown leaders, there is not a whole lot of political evolution. There's not a huge need to respond quickly to political change. You look at Egypt, a country that, quite frankly, is going to be lacking leadership for a little while. So how do companies, how does education think about that? How do we begin to think about that? So as we look towards leaders in growing economies and emerging markets, we really have to, as companies, become much more comfortable with risk, because in general, companies dislike risk. We commit to a quarter, we need to make that number, we don't want risk. But risk is what will actually drive a premium and enable companies to grow markets and grow talent. And so we have to be comfortable with a certain amount of risk in the portfolio, and that's a real challenge for companies.
How would it work in South Africa? How would it work in a parents' council when you introduce the notion of risk?
Well, we have to deal with risk. Let me just deal with two other issues before I get to the issue of risk. And that is, first of all, I don't think we should distinguish between business leadership and political leadership. And I think that's exactly the point the thing that Nelson Mandela taught us, that his legacy is that leadership is not about power. It's not about success in terms of numbers and figures, etc., etc., etc. And I think the second important point that I'd like to make is that Webster might have to rethink their definition after the developments of the last 12 months, the political developments and the economic developments. the revolt in the major cities against financial institutions and financial leaders, the big corporates. So I think we may see a new definition of success or of leadership in the very near future. As far as risk is concerned, risk forms a fundamental part of the function that a governing body and the parents must consider. And we're talking the whole range of issues that may be exposed to risk, from health to finances, from educational outcomes, health issues, safety issues, all of those.
Now let me take a question from the very patient person in the back, and then we'll come. The role of the media. Let's save it for the wrap-up comments and keep it going this way. The question was, I believe, way in the back, and you have the microphone.
Yeah, hi. I'm Sarah Misnet from Georgetown University, just here across the campus. And my question today is that from a youth perspective, we have trouble understanding why leaders of today don't want to collaborate with us. It's as if our ideas aren't polished enough to be implemented on the grand scale and on the bigger scope. So you're talking about radical change and how radical change comes around, and I think it comes because people in the youth don't believe that their ideas are being integrated into society in the correct way. We have our ideas, we just don't have the platform to share them. And that's why you see youth very active on media platforms such as Twitter and Facebook. And you talk about those starting revolutions. They start revolutions because we don't feel that we have the proper outlet in society that has been, established correctly for us to interact in a way with the greater community. And I believe that that's where the legitimate leadership will come from.
I agree.
Is it a fair charge? We don't listen and we don't collaborate.
It's fair. And we've seen in the recent developments over the past 12 months, I think the youth have taken the lead in challenging us as the older people because we haven't been listening.
But I think it's fear. I go down, I can't remember who said this, but, I think what's happened is we're in that unique historical moment where so much is changing and the youth has made the evolutionary leap. And the present leaders haven't. They are the change. And they've made that evolutionary leap. They've moved in, enabled by the digital technologies, but they've got the concept that more is more. More people doing more equals more. You add one person to the web and it's exponential. This whole thing is, in fact, the evolutionary leap we need, because if we continue to think of scarcity and we don't release those energies that you have, enabling us to have more, and therefore moving to abundance, we're not going to survive. The planet will and we won't. So they've made the evolutionary leap. We kind of understand it, but we don't have it in our gut, and we're scared. It's
when I
suddenly
talk
a
to
reversal.
Wayne, I don't get that. I don't sense that you're the kind of leader that wouldn't talk to a Georgetown grad and listen to them and encourage them. Is it a fair charge?
Completely fair. And bear in mind, whilst I try and be a millennial, I'm very much a Gen X with millennial ambition. Because, look, in a big corporation, Josephine hit it, right? Leaders are scared. They don't know how to communicate. And so back to your point, it's literally an alien concept to them because it's the speed. If you think, I certainly remember when I was growing up in business, you simply didn't connect to the CEO of a company. You didn't. There was a matrix and a chain of command. Today, and I'm pretty sure you would say this as a student today, if you want to know something about my company, then just email the CEO, right? Drop him an email, and you know what? He should reply within a day too. And that is such a different way of thinking to the generation that we grew up in. And if you look at our company, we've probably got 30,000 leaders that grew up in a different generation. And so, the challenge for us, certainly for me in a human resources role, is how on earth do we equip leaders to be able to do this? Because it's incredibly different. It takes them out of their comfort zone. And they, in some cases, they don't want to do it. And so we really have to think now about developing a leadership generation of tomorrow that's equipped to connect with people and equipped for the pace of change.
Now, we have some questions on Twitter. One is really terrific for us to wrap up, so I'm going to save that and take a question here. The lady in the red jacket, and then the lady in the second row. Then we'll go over here, and then fairly soon we'll be coming to a wrap-up, and I asked each panelist to think of what are the takeaways they'd like to take from this debate to make them better leaders. But first, a question. Back to Turkey,
yeah, okay.
I guess.
I'm Gülsün Salame from Turkey. We have been talking about these bottom-up approaches in the new leadership decision-making processes. So in the future, it will be more bottom-up, processes which will create impact on the decision makings. But we haven't talked about building trust between leaders and people. So that's very important in this process. I mean, if the leaders are able to build trust between the stakeholders and between the people and themselves, then the process will be much more efficient. What do you think about this, building trust and transparency?
Well, and what works in building trust?
Yeah.
Well, that's exactly the point I made right at the beginning, and that is that if a leader thinks he or she can lead without ethical values, and trust would be one of them, reliability, credibility, and most important, as far as I'm concerned, integrity. People must know that they can rely on this leader. And then the second part, which is about the compassion part, and that is connecting with people and realizing that it is about people and relationships. That's the essence as far as I'm concerned.
In this change of age, can you build trust?
Well, I don't have these answers because we've all got them. We've got to invent it. The trouble with the age we're going to is there's no rule books, you see. I mean, I've studied business and I've got all these libraries full of books telling me how to do things, but it's all I'm leading from the past. Leading from the future, there are no books, so I'm, with everybody else, making it up. So I might say something that has no sense whatsoever, but I'm giving it a shot. So I don't have any answers. But what I can say is that I've noticed that whereas leadership in the past was something that wasn't questioned and you didn't have to earn, now you have to earn your leadership more and more, and particularly again with young people. And I think earning leadership is ultimately about, and then therefore they will give it you, they will concede leadership to you because they respect you. And trust can only be on actually saying things and then doing what you say. And it's that simple, to be consistent in your thought and your actions. And then people know who you are, where you are, and if they buy into you, and they'll trust you. And that's the thing. How do you now, as a leader, earn people's trust and respect?
And just to add, I agree with Josephine, trust is personal. You can't teach trust to leaders. And so as we look at leadership development, we try and reinforce it's about authenticity, it's about sincerity. Because the balance of power now in employment is very much with the employee. They're very selective about whom they want to work for. And so in the war for talent, and there really is a war for the best talent, employees will select the organisation and the person that they work for. And to your point, they want to trust the person, not just with their career, but with a huge piece of their life. And so we have to be mindful of that and really try and encourage our leaders to kind of walk the talk with an authenticity, with an openness, because people work for the person and not the job title.
And interestingly, I don't know if anyone in the audience knows, there is a whole movement on authentic leadership. ALIA, I think, in Canada is one of the big groups there. And in Holland, where I still work a lot, with a lot of leaders, have been going through some of these authentic leadership. And it really is very demanding. It's asking of the leader to go into a very personal journey of their own intrapersonal and emotional and authentic space, so that you can discover your own authenticity, and if you discover your own authenticity, you are then able to be in the moment. And people know when you're in the moment because you're making the right decisions. So it's partly a personal journey for the leader.
We're at the 10-minute point. I wanted to see how many hands still have questions. We have 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's take those 4 right in a row, and maybe that will give us a chance to comment in a collective way, please.
Thank you. Mine is mainly a comment.
Where are you from?
I am from the Gambia. I'm the Minister of Basic and Secondary Education, and my name is Fatou Lamin Faye.
Welcome, Minister.
Thank you. My point is to do with the point that Paul made, that leaders do not need to empower people. They just need to recognize that people have power. And I think what we've done in the Gambia is when we had problems getting girls enrolled in schools and stay in school, what we did was to work with the mothers and created mothers clubs in collaboration with UNICEF, and have these mothers clubs work with the schools. And we started seeing great improvements in getting the girls enrolled and staying in school with the support of those mothers. And that is why we have been able to attain gender parity at the basic level. So it's important that we build the capacities of the parents, because they have a huge role to play in the education of the children. And I thought I should just share this, because it's an innovation that was done with UNICEF, and it's paying off for us. And I think although I must say that the fathers also attempted to establish a fathers club, but it didn't work.
That's why I'm concerned.
Thank you. Just pass the microphone back to the lady there, and then I believe the gentleman down the road. Go ahead.
Sarah Cunningham. I used to be, as of July, Arts Education Director for the National Endowment for the Arts in the United States government. And my comment, or maybe question, is related to the fact that we have a mechanism to address some of the concepts, knowledge mechanism to address what you're talking about at the youth level, because our young artists are in their 20s and 30s, and they look and they evaluate modes of knowing and thinking and being and seeing and observing and understanding, and they represent those in the works that they provide to us in choreography, in visual arts, in media arts, and they're constantly experimenting, and they're experimenting in a safe place, and so often if they're provided that opportunity. So I think that mechanism is a place to find the change ideas. It already exists in aesthetic knowledge, and so I just wonder what your comments are, because there is also, if you look at many leaders have aesthetic, they're constantly engaging in the arts in some way. It's in their leisure time. They can afford it. And so we have a challenge that it is sort of elite activity, and yet it's constitutive of knowledge and understanding of the world and other cultures, of self-understanding of where one's own limitations and ignorance might be. So I just wonder if you have any thoughts related to aesthetic knowledge.
Thank you. And after this gentleman, there was perhaps, back to Father Peter. Okay,
I'm sorry. Mine is the comment. First, I bet, I believe people will always need the leaders, successful leaders, to lead them.
And you are from Qatar?
I am Ahmed Al Hamadi. I'm from Abu Dhabi Education Council, UAE, Emirates. And I believe people will always need successful leaders to lead them. But now, I think a successful leader will be a leader who defines a message, but with the community. Here, where we need really, the leaders need these platforms to understand what the community requires, and then based on that, based on in this involvement, build a message that we all share and work accordingly. Because by that, we will be able to judge whether the leader is a successful one or needs to be, replaced or judged, I just wanted to say that. Thanks a lot.
The importance of shared vision. And this will be the last question, and then I'm going to have us come across the panel for a conclusion. Yes.
I'm Peter Bray I'm Vice-Chancellor at Bethlehem University in Palestine. I was very interested, Josephine, in your comment about 30, 40 years ahead of what the organisation will be like. I think the characteristics of the organisation that you mentioned are beginning to emerge now. And I think, therefore, we need to start thinking about a different way of thinking about leadership. Most of the ways in which even you people have been talking today, when you ask the question, where is leadership vested? Generally, it's vested in a person in a position. And I think we need to think of a different way of thinking about leadership and ask the question, what would happen if we vested leadership in the relationships that exist within a group? And it's a whole different way of operating, a whole different way of thinking about the way in which we collaborate. And so my question is, if we're going to think about leadership that way, what are the ways that we prepare for that? It's not, could I say, it's not focusing on individuals who are going to be prepared for leadership positions, but rather looking at ways in which as a group, as an organisation, we entrust people with the power for leadership to emerge from the nature of the relationships that exist there. So my question is, how do we in organisations, and I'm particularly interested in universities, how do we prepare people to be engaged in that sort of leadership?
And of course, the question from Twitter that so grabbed me was, can you teach leadership? And where do you teach it? Is it the workplace? Is it the university? Let's take a concluding comment from each of our panelists. And who would like to start? All right, so we'll go Wayne, Josephine, and Paul, the last word.
Sure, and some great questions there. You know, can you teach leadership? I don't think so. I mean, what you can do is work with leaders and equip them to be even better leaders. But, you know, more so in the 21st century than ever before, because of some of the personal traits now that come out in leadership. You know, again, think about the really successful CEOs of companies, the entrepreneurs. You know, they take risks, they're very visible, both personally and professionally, and that inspires and that leads to a following, which means they attract talent. And that's very different. And so a manager in the 20th century would have a job description and a job title that would determine what they do. Today, there are no boundaries, there are no barriers. So can you teach people that? Not really. What you can do is give them skills and techniques and tools that enable them to build on their base capabilities. And clearly, when you've got people that have development needs, you can help counter that. But I don't think you can actually teach the skill of leadership, because increasingly it's more natural and it's more intuitive. And so when people say to me, well, look, what is leadership to you? It's really simple. It's defining reality, give hope, supply direction. It sounds really easy, but, you know, be honest with them about what's going on. You know, give hope around where you're trying to take them, and give some base direction to help people get there. It sounds very easy, but it works for me.
Thank you.
I have no idea what leadership is. And that's serious because, and it's interesting, we have, even geographically, the gentleman here and the gentleman here with two different views of it. And I think just as everything is going to be everything and more of, and we're going to have so much diversity, we're going to have many different ways and many different models of leadership. Can you teach leadership? No. But can you experiment and explore leadership to find there won't be one leadership, there will be many different expressions of leadership. And the thing I think is that we have to start the journey. We've no idea what 30 or 40 years down the line will look like, because we will make it every day. But what we can do is, in all of our organizations, start to incubate, experiment, explore concepts of leadership. Because I'm certain there will be many different types, and bring them on. We don't want one type of leadership. There's no one size will fit all, not in the complex, diverse, colourful world we have. So I think that my optimism in this is, first of all, that looking and listening to the audience, and this has made me very happy, we seem to share a lot more than anything that divides us. And that is my takeaway. I'm going to go away incredibly happy about that, because I have actually experienced it, and that gives me hope. And the second thing is, let's just have the courage to risk. You start experimenting in GE, You experiment in where you are. You experiment in Bethlehem, and we will do it. We will try, we will fail, we will risk, we will make it. There will be many models.
I want to agree with my two co-panelists as far as the question on can you teach leadership is concerned. Nothing further to add as far as that is concerned. As far as the concept of a panel of leadership, of a circle of leadership, I think, and this is where Wayne and I have said earlier, that people look up to leaders. They want to work for leaders. No longer would they want to go to the University of Bethlehem. They want to go to X, Y, and Z's university, etc., etc. So there will always be this iconic leader, this inspirational person who will have to even lead the group. But the group is becoming more important in the process. And thank you for the opportunity to be here, to listen to the questions, and to hear what my colleagues and the audience have said. Great learning experience for me as well.
Well, I think these debates have created a community of people with an interest in leadership. The first university president I worked for, when I asked him, how do you tell what is a university leader, he said, they're just like fish. When they die, they go right to the top. I hope we've made some progress since then. And with leaders like our panel, I think we have a good chance of making it into the future. Thank you so much.